You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. It's Pi Day. Happy Pi Day, everybody. 3/14/25. It is Friday. We've only got 3 more days of the college basketball regular season, as it were. Obviously, we're in conference tournament time, so we're kind of out of the regular season. But the NCAA tournament certainly on the near horizon. We got the selection show coming up on Sunday. So a lot to happen here over the next few days. Some great basketball that will be on television here over the next couple of days. Unfortunately, no Indiana as they lose last night to Oregon. So on the show, we're going to talk about that game. We got a ton of questions from people about IU's place in the bracket, where they land. I'm going to try to answer as many of those as possible. I'm going to walk you through where I've got Indiana right now. Spoiler alert, I do have them in. It's tight right now, and we'll talk about why it's gotten tight. We'll also talk about some of the comments after the game, and we'll talk a little bit about this coaching search thing too, as there was a lot of tea being sipped and spilled online. Nothing, I think, earth-shattering, but certainly if you're online, you probably saw a lot of the discourse. So we'll chat a little bit about some of those items as well. Before we get to that, just a reminder, we're brought to you by homefieldapparel.com, your place to go for the finest in college fashions like this, the Assembly Hall 1971, the founding shirt, as I would call it. Many other IU-related items. Saw a bunch of them up at Gainbridge Fieldhouse yesterday. It was exciting to see all the IU fans up there, many of them wearing home field apparel. Many fans and other teams, Illinois fans and Purdue fans and all the folks that were there, most of them wearing home field apparel. And that's why it's the place to go for college sports fans, particularly college basketball. So much college basketball apparel, including some new shooting shirts and some special boxes, things like that. Head over to homefieldapparel.com, use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order, and we will hopefully have even more fun stuff coming up here soon. They've always got some fascinating new designs that come out during the tournament, and I've certainly tried to purchase as many of those as I can. I've still got my Shred of Destiny shirt somewhere in the closet. I got to dig that out, and we obviously got the Fairleigh Dickinson shirt from a couple of years ago. Always a winner. So head over to homefieldapparel.com, and we appreciate their sponsorship and their patronage. Also, just a reminder, we're on YouTube. Go to the Back Home Network YouTube channel, subscribe for free. You can watch the podcast there. If you were watching the podcast, you'd note I'm not in the normal studio. I'm in the aux studio, so no IU stuff behind me. There's no message there. We're just in a different studio right now. But would love to have you folks join us there and join us on the Substack, which is also free to sign up for, get podcasts and other items delivered right to your inbox. You can also donate to the podcast if you'd like to help keep it financially afloat. $5 a month, $50 a year. We appreciate it. We appreciate you folks. And it was, again, great to see so many of you up in Indy yesterday, both at Gainbridge and at Kilroy's earlier in the day and at a couple of other places later on in the evening. So let's talk about the game yesterday. Disappointing one for Indiana, certainly. They lose to Oregon 72-59. My analysis going into this game was that Oregon wasn't going to have a lot to play for. Indiana was. Indiana was going to be motivated by the loss 9 days ago. They were also going to have better officiating. Very few of those things ended up being true. Indiana did come out of the gates and look pretty good. And then the first 10 minutes gave way, and it wasn't nearly as good after that. Indiana surrendering a 13-2 run at the end of the first half. Where have we heard that before? And then they get, I think, some credit for chipping away and getting back into it, but they never could quite, say it with me, folks, get over the hump. And then, of course, they allow another big run at the end of the second half, a 12-2 run that took it from a 56-54 game to a 68-56 game and essentially killed it off, unfortunately. So, you look at the stats, what sticks out on a team level is a couple of things. One, Indiana did not play terrible defense in this game. They clearly were trying to focus on defending the post and trying to cut down on all the offensive rebounds that Oregon got in the last game. Oregon was almost at a 40% offensive rebounding rate in the game up in Eugene. Indiana cut that in half. It was 18.5% in this game. So real improvement in the paint as far as grabbing rebounds. The problem was Oregon was hitting everything. They shot 56.6% effective field goal percentage, 8 for 20 from three. They didn't need offensive rebounds in this game. Still, Indiana played okay defensively. Like, this was a relatively good defensive performance. Problem was they played terribly offensively. This was the second worst offensive performance they had in the entire Big Ten season, and it was really the second worst of the whole year. Like, if you look at offensive efficiency, raw numbers, this was the only game that was worse for Indiana this season was the Iowa game. They actually had a slightly more efficient offense in the Louisville game. That gives you a sense of how bad this was. Most of the problems were Indiana did not shoot the ball well, 39.1% effective field goal percentage. And this kind of lends credence to this idea that we've been floating on the podcast, that this tight rotation may be taking the legs out of the guys that are playing. And if you look at the trend, Indiana shot 66.7% effective field goal percentage against Penn State. They shot 56.6% against Washington. They shot 46.9% against Oregon. They shot 39.8% against Ohio State, and they shot 39.1% against Oregon. That's like a straight trend line down. Maybe it's just a correlation without a causation. Who knows? But to me, I look at that and I say this is a team that either, there was so much film suddenly on them and how to effectively defend the 6 or 7 guys that are out there, or they just lost their legs from a shooting perspective. And you look at the guys that normally perform like that. Luke Giddey, 0 for 5 from the field, had 1 point on the game, and really just struggled offensively throughout, really couldn't find his spots. Miles Rice, also 0 for 5. And I mean, Miles is not the guy that you're necessarily looking at in terms of going out and hitting a bunch of jump shots, but he was not having a good time with it yesterday. Trey Galloway, 4 for 12 from 2, 2 for 6 from 3. Troy really struggled. As great as the 9 assists were, he had 5 turnovers, and his shot just wasn't falling. You tip your cap to Mackenzie Mbako and Malik Renew, but it was just a tough game overall for Indiana in terms of the shooting, and Oregon did not have any such problems. So I think a team that definitely is in need of a rest, and hopefully it's not a full offseason rest. We'll see what happens in terms of the tournament selection. We'll talk about where this leaves Indiana. So Indiana, 19-13 after they lost to Oregon. And I think maybe the biggest and most damaging thing for Indiana in this process was that, the committee loves to occasionally talk about the eye test, which I hate. As a bracketologist, it's a subjective figure that doesn't really mean anything. But if you're going to try to quantify the eye test and say, well, it's about did you look effective while you were playing the game? Indiana did not look very effective in this game. Indiana looked tired. They looked stressed. They looked overwhelmed at times. They only scored 59 points in a game that they really should have played better in. And I think that could leave a sour taste in the mouth of the committee, who might be debating who are these last 2 or 3 spots going to go to. We had a bunch of questions on the bracket side of things. So Patrick asked, I'm confused. I basically was told after the Ohio State game that IU was in. Now it appears they're likely out. Well, pump the brakes on that. I don't think that they're out. And spoiler alert, my bracket has IU as the last team in right now. So what happened that dropped them? So I think the big issue right now, it's not that big of a drop. I had them as the 5th team in last time. So we're talking about a drop of 4. And really, if I'm being honest, it's a drop of 3 because I do not have North Carolina mentally ranked above Indiana. But I do think North Carolina is going to get in. 22 wins. Their AD is the chairman of the conference of the tournament selection committee, which, as much as they swear, that doesn't have any impact. I've been doing this long enough. It tends to have an impact when teams are potentially not going to get picked. They tend to get picked more often when their AD is on the committee. It also affects seeding a little bit. It won't affect seeding here, but I do think North Carolina is going to get in, especially with 22 wins and the chance to potentially beat a Duke team that will be likely missing Cooper Flagg today. We'll see what happens with that. But when I look at the other teams that are in the mix, the big problems Indiana is going to have in terms of how the committee evaluates them is that, they have 4 quad 1 wins, and now they're back to 8 quad 1 and 2 wins because Rutgers has dropped out of tier 2. They're now a quad 3 win. And that doesn't compare that favorably to some of the other teams that they're going against. Like Rutgers dropping out of that top 75 means that Texas, who's now on a 2-game winning streak, and even though Texas has one more loss overall, Texas has a better strength of schedule. And even though Texas has got 4 quad 2 losses, they've got 10 quad 1 and 2 wins. They've got 7 wins against teams that are on the board, and their metrics are better than Indiana's by about 10, 11 spots. Where I think Indiana still got an advantage is, you take a look at a team like Boise State. Boise State, who a lot of people, after they beat San Jose State yesterday, were like, oh, they're going to be in the field. Boise State's got fewer quad 1 plus 2 wins. They've got the same number of wins against the board that Indiana's got. They've got a less good top win. Indiana's win against Michigan State is still an incredibly good win. They have a worse strength of schedule. They have slightly better predictives, but they have significantly worse numbers in terms of their resume. So, when I think about it and you look at the teams that are in the mix, there's a world where I think Vanderbilt's in, San Diego State's in, Texas in, North Carolina's in, Indiana's in, Ohio State's out, Boise State's out, Colorado State's out. I still haven't seen anything from below that would make me think that any of those teams that are under that grouping are going to pop up. The one exception or the one question mark that we would have here would be Xavier. And I don't exactly know how the committee is going to deal with Xavier. Xavier has one more win in quad 1 plus 2 than Indiana, but they have one less win against the teams that are under consideration. They have basically the same road and neutral record that Indiana's got. And they've got better predictive slightly, but they've got a worse overall resume. So I'm just curious with Xavier, like, where do we see the committee decide that they're going to land? You could look at both resumes and you could have some level of confidence in saying, yes, this is the team that we want to put in. I'm just not sure if I'm not sure what direction the committee lands. And this is one of those weird situations where you can't even make the ticket sales argument. Because if it's between Indiana and Xavier to go to Dayton, the argument would be, oh, well, Indiana will sell a bunch of tickets in the first 4. Well, Xavier will too, since they are literally right down the road and they have a huge basketball fan base. So this is the one that concerns me. And then I guess the larger issue that we're dealing with now is that you're still dealing with some bid stealer possibilities. Greg Lamont asks, knowing my stance on conference tourney impact, which I've said it doesn't matter that much. I'm not saying it never matters, but I don't think it matters a huge amount. People were asking, like, could Indiana jump to a 10 or a 9? Like, that was never on the cards. Even with the loss yesterday, I don't think Indiana's getting punished too much. It's more a matter of, well, now as we get a little bit sharper focus on what teams are competing, what order do you put them in? And which team ends up without a chair of that group of teams that I just talked about if you throw Xavier into the mix? So Greg asked, do you put any stock in stacking wins on quad 2 games this week? Seems like North Carolina is getting national push for getting quad 3 and quad 2 wins. I would look at it less like that, Greg, and more from the perspective that I think what UNC is getting a push from is they have a really good non-conference strength of schedule, 5th in the country. And their predictives are really good, as we talked about on one of the earlier shows, because they've lost a lot of games by a small margin, which helps your predictives. Whereas Indiana doesn't have that benefit. Indiana has a decent number of games where they weren't that close. The game at Nebraska, the game at Iowa, the game against Louisville, this game against Oregon that they just lost. They lose that game by 13. Like, if they lose that game by 4, I think it's a different ball game in terms of their predicted numbers, but that matches the pattern. And whether or not it's a good thing, the reality is the metrics are going to matter at some point in the room. That's why the committee looks at them. And what they're supposed to say is predictive based upon who you've played, but also how you've played. The computers are saying if these two teams met on a neutral floor, North Carolina would be better than Indiana. Texas would be better than Indiana. That's going to be the question mark, because when that's a big delta, when it's a 20 or 25 spot delta like it is between Indiana and North Carolina, even though North Carolina doesn't have the wins, the computers are saying, well, this actually is a better team than Indiana by all of these different metrics. And this is where the committee is inconsistent from year to year, because some years they favor the wins and some years they favor a combination of the wins and the metrics. Rarely do they just favor the metrics, but you can't not pay attention to the metrics if that makes any sense. So I'm not sure if that ends up answering your question, Greg, but I do think that the biggest problem now for IU is they can't really make any more arguments in their favor. Their record is frozen in the eyes of the committee. And so now we have to keep an eye out on the bid stealing and the possibility that maybe a team like a Boise State or a Colorado State might put themselves in a position where they just look like they're playing better basketball than Indiana. And that is concerning. But even there, it's like Colorado State's a great example of this. Like Colorado State, 23-9, but their best win is at Boise State. And their second best win is Utah State at home. All their wins are essentially against the teams that they're competing against for spots. They are worse than Indiana in terms of some of the predictives. Indiana's better in KenPom, better in BPI. Indiana's got a better resume in terms of like their overall wins. So with them and with Boise State, I just have a hard time seeing either of those teams getting in over Indiana. And if they do, then what the committee is valuing is probably not going to help teams like Texas and Xavier and to some degree North Carolina. So it's one of those where it's a sliding scale, and the way I'm interpreting it right now is that Indiana is probably still just in good enough shape. But where they're going to have to really sweat it out is the games that are going to be going on today and tomorrow are going to lead to situations where you could have teams getting into the tournament in ways that would be problematic. So, for instance, you look down the list of the games that are going today, and let's ignore the top line games. In fact, I'm going to pop this up real quick for those of you who are watching on YouTube, so we can kind of go through what we're looking at. Look at the fan match section here on KenPom. So, Boise State, New Mexico. You want New Mexico to win that because I think New Mexico is pretty easily in the field. If Boise State wins that, well, that's another good win on a neutral floor, not against a quad one team, but a team that you're going to have to reckon with a little bit in terms of, it's a win that Indiana won't have on their resume. Utah State, Colorado State. You want Utah State to win that game because I think Utah State's already in the field. We've talked about the possibility of bid stealing out of something like let's say the A10. There was a question that we had on, and I got to find it here real quick. We had a ton of questions come in from you folks, which we appreciated. But the question was whether or not VCU would get in if they lost today. And I think it's that, VCU is another one of those teams where it's a really fascinating question to think about, because ultimately what VCU has going for them is more or less the same thing North Carolina's got going for them, which is their predictives are good. They're 33rd in BPI, they're 30th in KenPom. Those are 20 spots ahead of where Indiana's at, despite the fact they don't have a lot of top-end wins. I think VCU's probably getting in if they lose, because when you look at what they've got overall on their resume, 25-6 or 24-6 overall is probably going to be impressive to the committee. But a loss today is a lot more damaging to them than a loss tomorrow would be, if that makes sense. Because today, this is a team that's going to be playing against, who have they got? St. Bonaventure. So I think if they win that game, that's not going to help or hurt them. But if they lose the game, I could see that being a punishing sort of thing. But they're 30th in KenPom. Like eventually that's the type of team that's going to probably get selected because of how good they've looked in the metrics. And again, the other one I would keep an eye out for outside of the A10 in the Mountain West is, what happens with Memphis. And, Memphis in the American, they're a 10-point favorite today against Wichita State. Memphis is going to get in the field regardless, but I do worry like they lose, which is very much a possibility because Memphis is, I would call them a mercurial team. They've played some close games lately, which is why their power numbers aren't good, but they're 26-5. They are likely going to be a team that gets in. So these are the big impact games that Indiana needs to keep an eye on. And I would say, if you were just looking at wins, at quad one wins, which is kind of what we get trained to do as consumers as we go through bracketology, you would look at Indiana and say, well, of course they're in. not just because they don't have any bad losses, but because they've got some good wins. VCU's probably got, I mean, not probably, they definitely have a worse profile in terms of their wins, and they have a horrific loss early in the season to Seton Hall. But the flip side of it is they've just played better statistically on average over the course of the season than Indiana does. It was Noah Myers, by the way. And he also asked about Texas and North Carolina passing IU with wins. So that's kind of the scene there. So we'll keep an eye on it, but that's what I would anticipate as we go into this process of trying to figure out who's going to be in the field and how it all works out. Just a lot of really fascinating items that Indiana is going to have to consider as they go into this last couple of days of the conference tournament season. So, I would just hang on, and I would certainly root for favorites. And, you want to get teams like Texas out as quickly as possible because you don't want more damage done. You don't want more distance being put in. It'd be nice to see Texas have a 15th loss before they get a 20th win. And it's going to be tough for them to continue winning in the SEC tournament, but we'll see what happens. So anyway, we had a ton of other questions that I wanted to get to. And we had a nice one, and I think an interesting one from Buff Komodo. A lot has been made of the comments from Oumar Ballo for right and for wrong that happened after the game. And if you haven't seen those, I would go check the video out and watch as, Ballo talked very emotionally about how, their players are getting like death threats or death wishes or whatever on social media after losses. And, basically it's like, if you're not rooting for us, like maybe just leave us alone. This comes on the heels of the Coleman Hawkins video from a couple of days ago, which caused a lot of people to take pause, where Hawkins is in tears in the Kansas State locker room after the game. There was a lot of negative reaction to both of those statements from online fans. I mean, it was especially on X, but even in some other spots. There was also a lot of predictable. It was interesting watching like the journalists that cover college basketball react to the Hawkins video, because I saw 2 or 3 from journalists who was like, there's probably a lesson here, but I'm not sure what it is, which is an interesting way to go about it. So, what do we take out of this? And Buff Komodo's question was, what would you recommend Oumar, coaches, or other members of an athletic apparatus do when they face situations like he described in the comments? And, this has been tied into what Matt Painter's comments were about a month ago when he got interviewed after losing to Indiana. And it's tied in with some other comments that we've seen that have been specifically targeted at the IU fan base. And I saw a lot of general, like, well, we all need to be better as fans. So there's a lot of little elements here that I think are worth talking about. And the first is those types of comments, the comments like, well, we need to do better as fans, or, we need to be less aggressive or whatever. There's a real line, in my opinion, between the fans that are normal fans and the fans who engage in the type of behavior that you are seeing Oumar Ballo or Coleman Hawkins or Matt Painter talk about. There's this tendency, and I see this a lot with other non-sports related items. There's this tendency of well-meaning and well-intentioned people online seeing people react negatively to getting attacked or getting ridiculed or getting threatened on social media and say, I must be part of the problem. And, what I would always tell people is, if you're not engaging in that behavior, there's just not a lot that you can do to keep people from engaging in that behavior. And this is where I always get a little bit irritated at people chiding fans, or like, the Indiana fans are crazy. It's like, you can't paint with that broad of a brush. There are Indiana fans, unquestionably, that go online and do really despicable things and send awful messages to athletes and to coaches and to media members that they should have no right sending. This has been a long-standing problem, though. And what I think that we have to keep in mind is that there's a phenomenon that in communication studies that I've focused on a lot, because I'm an internet researcher as part of my day job, called the online disinhibition effect. You've probably heard me talk about it on this show before. And the summation of that theory, or it's really more of a set of observations rather than a theory, is that essentially people will act online in ways much different than they would act in person. And the reasons for those are most of the normal rules of communication that we obey as human beings disappear when you are not physically standing in front of the person that you're dealing with, or even listening to their voice react to what you're saying and have to deal with them in real time. There's all these different elements under the online disinhibition effect that talk about, there's this tendency to dehumanize the people that you're talking with because they don't seem real, because you're on the internet and they're on the internet and it's not a person standing in front of you. There's certainly an element of, there's things that you would get literally punched in the face for saying to somebody in person that you are not going to get punched in the face for saying them online, because there's no imminent physical threat for doing or saying something that's out of bounds from a societal perspective. There's a real de-emphasis on authority. And in fact, there's almost an emphasis on attacking authority. And when we talk about authority, we're not just talking about authority figures like police officers or coaches or whoever. We're also talking about people that are in positions of, public prominence on social media. Athletes fall into that category. Media members fall into that category. And so you've got this kind of runaway phenomenon that's been going on for a long time. I mean, I can remember I was a very early online adopter. Like, I remember being on CompuServe back in the early 90s, and then I was on the internet very early. I remember finding the Indie Star forums. There may be some of you out in the audience who are on those Indie Star forums. And those things, they were completely unmoderated, and they were an absolute cesspool. And it was, again, this was 1995. We're not talking about 2025. We're talking about, 30 years ago, where you've got people engaging in the same types of behavior that we are watching and seeing and hearing about people engaging in now. But the difference there was, it was on the frickin' Indie Star forum. Like, there was no direct connection to go say those things directly to somebody, to tweet them or DM them to somebody directly, to email them to somebody directly. And so, there was a barrier there. And, I've always felt, you look at that, and, that is what human beings will often do when they don't have all of the societal restrictions keeping them from saying the things that they will mentally or emotionally come up with to say. These are not things that they should be saying. These are things that are not part of an organized society. These are violent and, really disgusting kinds of things that should be negatively reacted to. But when there's no barrier, when there's nothing stopping you, you're going to go ahead and make those comments. Some people are, not everybody. And this is where it gets troublesome. And so this is where, when I see the comments from Ballo or the comments from Coleman Hawkins, and I see then media members and coaches turning that around and saying, see, fans are the problem. It's like the people they're talking to, the ones that would be listening to those comments in the first place, are not engaging in that behavior by and large. I would say maybe a couple of %, but most of the people who would actually react to people saying, well, fans are the problem, they're talking to people who are not the problem. And the people that are the problem, there's not really a way to communicate to them that what they're doing is awful. There's no punishment for it. And this is where I've always kind of been a bit suspicious of this idea of an unmoderated internet, because human beings have demonstrated over and over again, at least in our society, that they are not going to communicate in an orderly manner unless there's somebody there making sure that they are behaving themselves. And that might sound like, you're restricting my freedoms or whatever, but the reality is we've got 30 plus years of online discourse that we can point to, that we've all seen, that illustrates that unless you have strong moderation, every online resource, every social network goes to hell, because it eventually gets taken over by people for whom it is not about an earnest exchange of ideas. It is instead about going and saying the things that you want to say, that you feel like you're not allowed to say, or you're there strictly to troll people or try to make them feel bad because you're gaining some kind of a perverse sense of pleasure from it. It's not something that's just unique to athletes. I've talked with our friend Trisha about this, what she and a lot of other female broadcasters and female reporters deal with on social media is atrocious. It's disgusting, There's things that get sent that you wouldn't, especially for our male members of the audience, there's things that are sent that you wouldn't even believe. And then when they're brought up, a lot of times you're criticized. And you're like, well, that's just part of the business, which is actually a lot of what the criticism has been for Oumar Ballo. Like a lot of people hopped in the comments and basically were like, well, you're getting paid. This is part of the deal. David West, former Pacer, guy you would have thought would have been a little more sympathetic, basically said, well, this is what happens when money's involved, which to me is not a great answer. And this is where, to some degree, like you can't treat bad behavior online like we treated cheating in recruiting, where it's like, well, we're not going to talk about it specifically. We're not going to name names. We're not going to out people for doing bad things. We're just going to say, God, it's really bad out there. Well, that doesn't really work with this because it doesn't solve the problem. And as we've seen, the online spaces generally get worse and worse unless there's something that's very carefully cultivated. And when you bring non-public communication like DMs into the mix, it makes it worse. I saw a lot of people saying that Oumar Ballo and other athletes, like, well, they just shouldn't be on social media. I mean, there's no point in being on social media, which is wrong for a couple of reasons. A, on the one hand, this is the generation that grew up with social media. This is a primary form of communication for people under the age of 30. And for those over 30, it was already a big form of communication, but this is what you grew up with in most cases. You're used to communicating with friends. You're used to being online. You become quasi-famous, and now you're being subjected to a whole ton of abuse on the same platform that you've been using for social interaction. It's not like you're just choosing to be there and that you could just choose to not be there. That's not how it works today. It might seem like it for people over the age of 30. It's like, well, just get off social media. That doesn't make sense even just from a basic social perspective. Like, this is where society is, at least in our society. It's on social media, especially if you're in sports or media. Like, this is the fulcrum point for so many things. Like, for all the people who complain about name, image, and likeness, and they're like, well, we don't want it to be pay for play. It should be for intrinsic value. Where do you think the intrinsic value of athletes in college is? It's not some random thing. It's your social media. Sydney Parrish, like, the value she provides to sponsors and advertisers is largely because she has a huge social media following that she herself has cultivated over time. So to turn around and say, hey, Oumar Ballo, just don't be on social media is really stupid. It is not thinking things all the way through. And I look at that and I say, you've got to have social media that treat people better. I don't know that you'll find that because all of the social media outlets and many of the message boards have ultimately just abandoned any idea of moderation. They've abandoned any idea of actually policing their audiences. And there's a perverse incentive structure that a lot of people find in going and being as bad and as awful as they can to these folks, because there's, it's, for some people, it's fun, which makes no sense to like normal people in society, like I'm assuming most of the people in our audience are. But there's a whole sector of the internet, especially amongst younger people, for whom this is a normal way of communicating. Without a good moderation structure, you're going to end up with worse and worse spaces. And to just say, hey, get off of the thing that you have to be on if you're going to have any kind of market value in this era doesn't make a lot of sense. I would also say that if you think about it, and this is where, fans get blamed, a big part of the blame here is coaches and schools. And this is not something I've heard talked about very much. This is an industry, college sports, where we have heard athletic directors and athletic programs and head coaches and former head coaches who are now in the media complain about entitled athletes and complain about the fact that there's money in the mix now for athletes, that they don't deserve it, that, there's a lot of jealousy from the prior generation of coaches and athletic directors, and it's certainly changing the model. And what they did in this process was essentially created a very hostile environment among fans towards players, because when you hear people who are in positions of authority over and over again for years, as we did, and we heard it all the way up to the NCAA level, say athletes don't deserve compensation, athletes aren't employees, athletes are amateurs, Amateurism is the most important thing, and professionalism is what's going to destroy college sports. You're creating an atmosphere among fans where fans are going to be programmed to look at athletes and not be sympathetic to them, instead to be sympathetic to the messages that are coming from the athletic departments and the coaches. And that is the atmosphere that we've been in now for the last 4 or 5 years. So to hear people say, well, it's the money and you got to expect this to come with the territory. There's a part of that that's true. But a lot of it is also when you set the table and say these people don't deserve this money in the first place, you've essentially set up a large part of the online fan base to say, hey, athlete, how dare you complain? You're getting paid when you don't deserve to be. That for a lot of people, whether they want to admit it or not, is the way they think about this stuff intrinsically. The other thing I'll say is I have a hard time buying the argument from coaches like Matt Painter or from athletic departments that they're concerned about athletes in this space when they, from the beginning, as a legal strategy, have said, we're going to give you no help with signing with agents. We're going to give you no help with any of the financial aspects of the money that you're making through NIL. We're going to give you very little help in most cases with your social media. We'll help you collect pictures, maybe, and items, but we're not going to help you moderate your social media. We're not going to help to keep away the bad folks that are coming at you and saying terrible things. Athletes have been put in a position because they're earning money and because the NCAA and its member schools don't want them to, where the NCAA said, fine, you're on your own. And they've thrown these 18, 19, 20-year-olds into an environment where they're having to face things as a professional, and no one seems to care about that. Like, there's so much support that could be provided, that should be provided, that is not provided. And it is largely because of money. And it's because of the idea that if we start providing support to these athletes in that way, now you're acknowledging their professional status, you're acknowledging the fact that they're employees, and we couldn't possibly have that. So it feels disingenuous on the one hand to complain about fans when you know that the vast majority of the fan bases are not engaging in these things. And I think Indiana's in that mix as well. And when you've got bad people who are engaging in it, you're not actually doing anything about those people. You're not actually helping the athletes deal with those people specifically, unless it gets to the point where you can actually prove something from a criminal perspective. There's a lot of things that need to change in this mix. Some of it is we need to stop making athletes at the college level making money seem like it's a violation of the laws of nature. The rhetoric, whether or not it will be acknowledged from the college athletics landscape, the rhetoric has set the table for a lot of what we're seeing here. And it activates what we already knew existed. If you had done any studying of the internet for the last 30 years, it activates something we already knew was there. You've now got social media, which allows people to anonymously connect directly to athletes. You've got athletes who have to be in that space because it's where a lot of their intrinsic NIL value comes from, because that's what gives them an audience that allows them to advertise things, because that's where the money's coming from. This is why ultimately a pay-for-play system would be helpful, because now you're just acknowledging that these are employees. We're paying them as such. You're still going to get abuse, and I don't think that that's something that ever gets completely out of the system. But to claim that all fans are to blame, especially in one particular fan base, is ludicrous. And there's not a lot that the good fans can do to stop the bad fans. What are you supposed to do? You can try to self-police message boards, see how far that gets you. How are you supposed to self-police as a fan base on Twitter? You can knock out the public comments, but what are you supposed to do about people that are not making public comments? And, where's the moderation from that social network that you're on that's supposed to be addressing these things? I mean, Twitter or X has actively gone the other direction. And anybody who's been on X over the last 3 years has seen what the result of that has been. So these are all things I think just need to be considered in this process. And I, for one, am really sorry to hear that Oumar Ballo and others have dealt with that. I knew it existed. I'm sorry to hear it publicly acknowledged. I'm curious what exactly any fan base is supposed to do when you've got good fans who aren't doing it, bad fans who are. The fans aren't the ones that can do the policing. Like, they're the ones that have the least power in this. And yet the good ones generally as a group get blamed when most of them are not engaging in it at all. And there is a line between public discourse around games and the kind of things that Ballo was talking about. And I think that there needs to be an important distinction that's brought up there. Anyway, a lot to talk about there. That's some of my thoughts on it. But to me, like, it's a situation that needs to be diffused, but the diffusing has to come in a variety of different spots. It's not just a straightforward, well, this fan base sucks, and therefore, they're a real problem. It's not nearly as simple as that, first of all. And I would love to see some solutions that didn't just involve chiding people and then moving on because you've gotten all of the social media hits that you needed that day for doing the chiding. Anyway, let's dive forward and let's talk about some other items here. So a lot of talk yesterday regarding the coaching search. And, Jeff Goodman had a tweet that highlighted Ben McCollum, the Drake coach, who's been the person who's been a lot of conversation around. Rick Bozich this morning had, I think, Brad Brownell and Ben McCollum as the top two on his board based upon things that he's been told. So I want to tackle a couple of things here. First of all, Logical Hoosier asked, this coaching search started as something I was very excited about. Change is needed in Bloomington. The media has made it almost unbearable, mostly from calling out the fan base for unrealistic expectations. Where do you think this job stands in the national spotlight realistically? I mean, I've talked about this a bunch before, but I guess my summary at this point is until you see who the coach is that's ultimately hired, I don't know that there's a good way to evaluate the relative strength of the job. I do think that in this era, IU has a lot of things going for it. You've got NIL money significantly. You have a very passionate and engaged fan base, which can be weaponized for good, shall we say. You've got expectations. I do think that this argument that the expectations at IU are unreasonable, as we've talked about many times, are disingenuous arguments from people who are trying to advocate for coaches who have not necessarily succeeded in that environment. And, again, I think the problem that Indiana's had, though, is they've just had this long succession of coaches that haven't succeeded. After a while, even if you know the granular details of the situation and why each one didn't, people are going to point to the larger pattern and say, see, Indiana's got unrealistic expectations. It's a dumb argument, and it's oftentimes a disingenuous argument. And I think ultimately, when you get right down to it, it's a very attractive job. It's constantly, when you see coaches polled, it's a very attractive job, but it's an attractive job in the vacuum. And you take it out of the vacuum and you look at individual coaches' circumstances, and it becomes one of those jobs where it's like, yeah, no, it's a great job, but why would I leave my current job for that job? And this is where, to some degree, it's not just NIL. It's not just, the idea that you can have success a lot faster because of the transfer portal. You can put a team together a lot faster. A lot of the things that were important, like recruiting basin, what's your recruiting area? Where are you going to have the most impact? That's not as important now as it used to be. So it's a good, like, highly respected job, but you've got a bunch of coaches who are in jobs there where they don't necessarily need all of the things that Indiana can provide because they've already got a lot of them at their places that they're at currently. So you have to have a particular set of circumstances that works for both parties. And when I look down the list, again, and we've gone through this a bunch before, a lot of the coaches that are at the top programs in the country right now either started as assistants and have been there forever, or they were programs that hired coaches when the program themselves was at kind of a down cycle. They hired a coach that looked like they were on a really good pathway, and it's worked out. I think Indiana's just been kind of unlucky in some ways in that their coaching hasn't worked out. And so I think that two things can be true there, I guess, is what I'm saying. You can have a good job, and it may just not be that attractive. But again, I'll go back to what I keep saying. Until a coach is named, I would just really heavily advise everybody to stop paying attention to the unsourced or unpublicly sourced rumors of who is interested in the job and who is not interested in the job. Stop taking that as gospel. I think that's one of the biggest issues with both the length of the search, but also with the level of the job. And so you've got a lot of people who know, like, you know, we've got agents in the mix. We've got reporters talking to coaches saying, well, no, I'm not going to take that job. But who's going to say, yeah, you know what, I'm really interested in that job? Like, ask yourself that. It would be big news if a coach said, yes, I'm interested. When was the last time you saw that? When was the last time you actually saw a tweet or a story from an active coach somewhere saying, I'm really interested in that other job that isn't my job right now? I mean, really, tell me, when did that happen? So all of this talk behind the scenes of this coach has turned IU down or that coach has turned IU down, I will say with a good degree of certainty that what you're hearing is either irrelevant or not accurate. It might be in the moment accurate, but that is a concern that you need to think about when you see these things. And I see so many IU fans who have been beaten down by this coaching search because they keep getting told by people who aren't revealing their sources that this coach has turned IU down or that coach has turned IU down. And we know with a lot of the autopsies and the postmortems on coaching searches in the past that it isn't how it's normally gone. And yet that's what gets reported in the meantime because there are vested interests in reporting it the way that people report it. So that's about the best I can say in terms of all of that. Now, I had a ton of questions about Ben McCollum, and I have somehow ended up becoming the avatar for the Ben McCollum resistance, as it was. I'm not sure how that happened, but we did a video early on when we were evaluating coaching candidates, and I highlighted that I was a little bit taken aback by how slow Drake played. Talked about McCollum's lack of experience at the Division I level. Talked in a subsequent podcast about, you know, McCollum from an offensive efficiency perspective, not as good as I would have liked to see so far this year. Yes, I know he's playing with some Division II players. I have paid attention. But I think that, you know, when I look at it, and I would recommend everybody go watch the video that Tony Adrania posted. I thought he did a really good job of breaking down a lot of the good aspects of Ben McCollum's coaching. He clearly is a very interesting coach. He's clearly a coach that's got a dedicated system in place that he adapts at times. He clearly had a tremendous amount of success at the Division II level. And, you know, to win 30 games is impressive whatever level you're at. I acknowledge all those things. My biggest concerns are, I hear Tony and others say, well, he'll be able to recruit at the level that Indiana needs to recruit at. I'm not convinced. I don't know how attractive that system is necessarily going to be to the types of athletes that Indiana will need to recruit in the Big Ten. Maybe it will be. Maybe it'll be incredibly successful. Maybe Indiana turns into, you know, Wisconsin of the 2000s or Virginia of the 2010s, where you have a lot of success and you're playing a very smart system that's a little bit slower paced. I just worry because I don't see much of a track record there right now in terms of the actual recruiting at the Division I, the high Division I level. When you throw in NIL, people are like, oh, NIL will solve that. Did we learn nothing from this year with Mike Woodson? NIL did not solve any fundamental issues. People wanted to come play for Mike Woodson, I think, from an NIL perspective because he placed players in the pros, which is an understandable reason why you would want to come. I mean, did Miles Rice, Miles Rice coming, maybe people would be like, that wasn't great. But at the time, everybody was like, that's a great pickup. Did he come in part because, wow, Jalen Hood-Schifino made the NBA under Mike Woodson? Did Oumar Ballo come because, hey, Khalil Ware and Trace Jackson-Davis both made the NBA? You're not going to have that with a Division II coach with 1 year of experience in the Missouri Valley. Will that build up over time? Perhaps. But what worries me, again, and this is where I'll come back to what I said a couple of days ago. I am just fundamentally uneasy with how important and what a fulcrum point this particular spot in time is for IU and their program. I am very concerned about hiring a guy with not just no head coaching experience except for this 1 year in D1, but not even assistant coaching experience at this level in D1, with how fundamentally different the high level of Division I is in terms of running an entire program, not just the recruiting, but donor interfacing, having to take, all of the different elements into play in terms of leading not just a team, but leading an entire program, running an 8-figure budget, with all of the different elements going in. I think McCollum from an X's and O's perspective looks really, really good. Let's give him some time. Let's give him some seasoning in Division I. If that means you miss out on a guy, I don't think Indiana's in a position right now to take the kind of risk that it would take to hire somebody who doesn't have but almost 1 year of Division I experience. People point to Bruce Pearl. Bruce Pearl was a great Division II coach. Look at him now. He's arguably like one of the top 3 coaches in college. Yes, Bruce Pearl spent 4 years at Milwaukee after he left Southern Indiana. It wasn't like Bruce Pearl jumped from Southern Indiana to Tennessee. And he did really well, progressively better over those 4 years at Milwaukee. And that was the platform that got him the Tennessee job. But again, even there, it's like Bruce Pearl took over a Tennessee program that had missed the tournament 4 years in a row and was really desperate to try to get themselves even back to the limited level of success that they'd had with Jerry Green as the head coach at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. I don't think Indiana's in it's an important point here, but Indiana is in a position where to hand the keys over to somebody who's only run not even a full season yet of a Division I Missouri Valley program. And the Missouri Valley is not exactly a top league in college basketball. Like the Missouri Valley they're 11th right now in the KenPom rankings. They're behind the American, they're behind Conference USA, they're behind the Atlantic 10, the West Coast Conference. To me, it's a big risk on a guy who may end up being a great Division I coach. He's certainly very young. I mean, Melissa M., I had no thoughts on Ben McCollum as a coach, but I'm stunned to find out he's only slightly older than me. Yeah, he's 43. He's younger than me. I think it's a huge positive, says Melissa. He has the look of someone with a good amount of authority, but he also has youth on his side, which ain't a bad thing. Fair. But again, when I look across at the various coaches that have had success at the high power level, very few of them just came out of nowhere having not coached. Like most of them, they're coaching, like Nate Oates coached at Buffalo. Dan Hurley coached at Rhode Island, and before that coached at, I think, Wagner. There's a base level there where you have to step up a little bit in terms of management. If you could hire Ben McCollum as your coaching assistant, like your primary coach that's actually doing all of that, like that would be amazing. But to just hire him as the head coach with all of the things and all the complications that Indiana brings to the table as a program, I really do think it's a huge risk. I mean, Jared from Assembly Call asked, IU fans are understandably focused on the Cignetti hire as a frame of reference for this men's basketball hire. What elements of the Cignetti hire are fair to include in a hiring template for IU basketball, and which ones are irrelevant, misguided, or inapplicable? I mean, the thing is, the Cignetti template is great, but what you have to remember about Cignetti, he had 10 years of assistant coach experience at the power conference level. He was at North Carolina State, and then he was at Alabama under Nick Saban. And then he had 7 years of Division I head coaching experience. Now, I think 4 or 5 of those years were in FCS. But again, the leap from FCS to FBS, where, that's not that big of a leap at that level. It's a leap, but it's not the huge leap that you might think it is. You've got most of the trappings of FBS in the FCS level. And at the FBS level, at James Madison, this is a guy who is recruiting the same level of players that Tom Allen was recruiting. I mean, let's be honest. Go back and look at, who was Tom Allen recruiting? He was recruiting guys that were looking at MAC schools, looking at Sunbelt schools, looking, at some cases at Conference USA schools, as well as obviously the players that would be looking at the SEC and the ACC. So, to me, even if you want to look at the elements around Cignetti, to me, what makes Cignetti such a great coach and what made him such an inspired hire by Scott Dolson and Pam Whitten was that Cignetti is a great logistical manager of people. He has systems that he uses, and he's got a staff that executes that. And he brought a large number of players who we had questions about whether they were going to plug in at the Big Ten level, and they did. And look, I'll be the first to say Indiana overachieved this year from what we thought they were going to. They overachieved against a schedule that, was about the midway point of college football this year. I don't see McCollum having all those advantages. He got a brand new staff, if I'm not mistaken, at Drake. Yeah, he brought a bunch of players from Northwest Missouri State up. I would be careful about automatically assuming that those same players who were the ones that installed, he even said this in one of his podcasts, those are the same players that installed the culture of his system, not just to his players, but also to his coaches. I'd pump the brakes on the idea that leap could happen at the IU level. This is where I think you got to be cautious. I mean, people were wild for Josh Schertz. And, Josh Schertz coached at Indiana State for 3 years. He got them from 230th in Ken Pom to 100th in Ken Pom to 38th in Ken Pom in a 3-year span. They had the 13th best offense in the country, best shooting team in the country when they were at Indiana State. First year at St. Louis, brought some of his guys from Indiana State with him. They're 19-13, 103rd in Ken Pom. They took a step back. Robbie Avila, I think is how you pronounce it. His offensive rating at Indiana State his sophomore year was 127, 52nd most efficient player in the country on offense his sophomore year. Goes to St. Louis, his offensive ratings dropped to 108. There's leaps here. And I think that IU fans are understandably enamored with McCollum's clear X's and O's acumen. But there are a lot of other elements structurally that I worry about in terms of making that leap that quickly. And so I do worry about how all of that ends up working out and whether or not you end up with a situation where you just get a guy who, yes, he's got all the X's and O's, but he's in over his head with all of the other items. And you can say, well, no, this is different, but you're just arguing basically you don't have any evidence that that's the case, is my point. Like, you can't really say that what you're doing organizationally at the D2 level will translate to the D1 level. And I thought Tony made a good point on his video about, this is a guy who was effectively recruiting players who they had D1 offers, probably low D1 offers, to go to D2 and play for him at Northwest Missouri State instead. That's true. But again, like there's a big leap that goes beyond that when you try to recruit players, at this level and you're plugging them in, and it doesn't appear like he's got a lot of those relationships. I just think it would be such a huge jump that it's not something Indiana has the luxury of rolling the dice on, given you're going on a long time now before, since Indiana's had like legitimate on-court success that people could feel good about consistently. So look, if there was a question about, what if Dolson ends up hiring McCollum, are you going to be able to get over it? Yeah, look, if ultimately, I don't have anything, I have nothing personally against Ben McCollum. I just don't think it'd be a logical hire given all of the factors I just listed. And, there's people coming at me in the comments like, you don't want a winner in Ben McCollum. Like, get out of here with that. That has nothing to do with it. There's plenty of winners. I mean, I'll note, like, if we want to go down that road, Link Darner won a D2 national title at Florida Southern in 2015. And that was after having been to, a couple of regionals and Elite Eight, had a 753 win percentage at Florida Southern. Went to Green Bay, where Doug Gottlieb is now, in 2015-16. Went 23-3 that year. Made the NCAA tournament. Won the Horizon League tournament that year. Got fired 4 years later. Is at Tampa right now. And went 8-20 his first year. Went 19-9 this year. Had a better season. Is Ben McCollum a better coach, X's and O's coach, than Link Darner? Yeah, certainly. But again, Link Darner won 75% of his games, won a national title, went 36-1 at Florida Southern. Something was going right. It didn't translate up to that next level. Now, McCollum's passed the first test in that he's made the NCAA tournament, won 30 games at Drake. All I'm saying is let's season him a little bit more. Let's keep it rolling and see how he does over a longer period of time. I just think you need a little bit more evidence at this level if you're really going to feel certain about where you're going. But if Scott Dolson goes through all of this and is like, that's the guy, clearly there's something else there that is being discussed that they've learned in the process where they're like, we really think this is the guy. And so then at that point, we'll see. I don't think I'd be particularly excited about it, but I'm not going to be mad about it if it happens. To me, it seems like an unnecessary risk. So that's all. Let's see. A couple of other questions. We're basically at time here as we've been going for about an hour. Mike Hutzel says, I had 2 Purdue fans try to move me out of my seat yesterday. They even went to get an usher to argue it further. But I was right and got to keep my seat. Is that one of IU's greatest moments in Big Ten tourney history? Mike, it's probably top 3. Like, it really, like, I'm trying to think of better moments. But successfully fending off entitled Purdue fans at Gainbridge Fieldhouse, I think we should hang a banner for that. Like, replace the Indiana's all-time 1976 March Madness team and put Mike Hutzel fought off Purdue fans in 2025. I would be completely in favor of that. That'd be amazing. Well, good for you. I'm happy to hear that. C. Boggs said, Greg McDermott is the Vegas favorite to get the IU job. Do you think he's the leader right now? I don't know who the leader is. I'll say this. I think McDermott would be a really interesting hire. I really enjoyed watching them yesterday fight back against DePaul. They run a really good offense. They really seem to know what they're doing. I think you could do a lot worse than Greg McDermott. I'm not advocating for him, but I don't understand why people have just kind of decided they're not going to pay attention to him. You do worry with a guy, is he going to be committed for the next 8 to 10 years at a high enough energy level? I don't know enough about McDermott to say for sure, but I do think that it's an interesting thing to talk about. I don't know where the noise is coming from, but I don't think he'd be a bad hire at all. And he's got quite a bit of experience at really high levels of basketball. And Creighton. For Creighton to be as prominent as they've been over the course of the last decade, basically in the Big East, with a team in Omaha, Nebraska, a private school that doesn't have a local recruiting base really to speak of. That's a really impressive stretch. A lot more impressive than Brad Brownell. Like, if it was a try, and honestly, like if it was like, if the Bozich report earlier was right, and it's like, oh, it's Brownell or McCollum, which again, I'm not sure that I necessarily buy, but that Rick may know more than I do. But I would rather have Greg McDermott than either of those two guys at this point, just given the background of everything and the track record that they've managed to establish. Al Forno, one of our favorite longtime commenters, noting on the coaching search, can you rewind the last 5 to 6 weeks was on who was the guy week by week online? This is a great point. We had a Brad week. We had a Dusty couple of days. Mick Cronin was all of a sudden the guy for like 3 days. Then Goodman pushed TJ Otzelberger, so that had steam for 5 days. Then Scott Drew. Then it was Brad again. Then it was Chris Beard. Remember, we had like Chris Beard Friday and Saturday. And now it's Ben McCollum. And it is, I think that Al hits on a really important point. There's a lot of, it's just the whole thing feels orchestrated. The whole thing feels like, well, we've used up this name. Let's go to another name that we know is going to get people riled up, which is why I have a hard time, even from reputable reporters, taking a lot of this stuff without a grain of salt. Like, it's hard to just accept, hey, yeah, this is definitely the guy that they're talking about now. Like, again, we've talked about who would know. And if your answer is agents or if your answer is coaches, I got news for you. That may not be the most reliable source of information about this search itself. We had Will Wade for a little bit too. Chris DePlant asked, I know the coaching search is speculation, but why is Greg McDermott the heavy favorite betting wise? I'll be honest, I have not followed the possible coach betting line history enough to be able to effectively say who's setting those lines. I think that it might just be dartboard throws more than anything that has to do with actual information. Because again, I don't know where they'd be getting the information from, but if they're getting it from agents, well, that might be your answer. There may be a vested interest to try to get McDermott's name pumped up for reasons that I'm not totally sure of myself, but it's an interesting thing to think about. CSW Hoosier asked, I've seen a lot of talk from folks connected to the university that the next coach will not be someone that folks are currently discussing and that the announcement will come out of left field. Who is not currently a candidate that could be in the running for the job? This is the problem. I don't know what the parameters are of that. Like, if the parameters are, will it be Brad Brownell, Ben McCollum, Greg McDermott, or the field? I would bet the field 99 times out of 100. A lot of the names that you've seen on the various hot boards that have been eliminated or backed down the order, again, it reminds you of the number of people who didn't think Curt Cignetti was a reasonable candidate. I mean, there were people, I always go back to the ESPN reporter that covers the Big Ten for football, 3 days, I think it was, before Tom Allen got fired, said, well, we think Tom Allen's coming back next year because there's no smoke about him being fired. And then, of course, he got fired. And then the same reporter was like, what we're hearing is Jason Candle from Toledo. And it was definitely not Jason Candle. So I am fundamentally skeptical of the information flow on most of these things. And there was an interesting tweet. I think it was from the Time account, which most of you know on Twitter, if you've been on Twitter, that highlighted a number of tweets historically from Jeff Goodman specifically about coaches that was worded very similarly, or the tweets were worded very similar to the one that was sent about McCollum. And none of those coaches ended up actually being the hire at the places that they were eventually hired at. So, for instance, from last cycle, Penn State's Micah Shrewsbury emerged as one of the leading candidates for the Georgetown opening. Utah State's Ryan Odom has emerged as a top candidate, arguably the frontrunner for the South Florida opening. That was on the 24th. Chris Beard has emerged as one of the leading candidates for the Arkansas opening on 4/4. Kansas State coach Jerome Tang, the next day, has emerged as the leading candidate for the Arkansas opening. Spoiler, he didn't get that. Frank Martin emerging at Cincinnati in 2019. That didn't happen. Richard Pitino being mentioned as the replacement for Kenny Payne last year. Didn't happen. Worded very similarly. Now, just keep that all in mind, is all I'm saying. It's not the end of the world when you see tweets like that, but it is going to be interesting to see how it all plays out, because it just feels like a lot of smoke across the board with a lot of these things. It's really a fascinating time, and it's very confusing for fans. And I am sympathetic to you all on that front, which is why we've tried not to engage in too much skepticism. So I'm looking through any other questions. We had a ton of questions. We're just not going to be able to get to all of them, unfortunately. I did want to shout out Mike Petrie, Michael Tilka, Dan Carell, all correctly identified where that the St. Ambrose was located. Davenport, Iowa, I believe was the location for it. So congrats to all of you and everybody else that got that as well last time. We'll have a lot more coming up over the course of the next couple of days. And I think ultimately we may have something by Monday. Like, there was one other question that I'm looking for the question and I can't find it right now. I know it's in this stack of questions we've got. But a lot of the question was basically what ends up occurring in terms of recruiting from a timetable perspective. When does Indiana need to hire somebody? So I was actually talking about this last night with one of my friends about the timing of when something happens. If you're Indiana, and this is where things get a little bit perverse. It was Jim Hoff. I was hoping I would find it. I knew it was somebody, and Jim's been a long-time commenter for us. What do you think the impact of the time it takes to hire a coach affects recruiting? If this drags on for a long time, we're going to lose out on some recruits. And I'm assuming that Jim's talking about like portal recruits. And I would say this is where Indiana is in an awkward spot. And it's where some other schools that maybe want to make changes are in an awkward spot. I think it's why Minnesota announced when they did. It's why North Carolina State announced when they did. Because the portal opens the Monday after the first week of the tournament. It opens with the 24th. That's 10 days from now. And you got to not just figure out who on your own team is coming back, but you've also got to figure out who you're going to get out of the portal. You got to start making contacts. You got to start having conversations. Everybody's going to have a price. You got to figure out if the price is worth what you're getting out of the player, how it fits into what you're planning on doing. It would be a real dangerous game for Indiana in particular to go past this opening portal date and not have somebody named. And it creates a kind of a perverse structure where it's almost like Indiana, frankly, for the future, doesn't want to make the NCAA tournament. Because if you make the tournament, let's put it this way, if Indiana misses out on the tournament, if Sunday comes and goes and they're not in the tournament and they're able to get out of playing in the Crown or the NIT, they turned down the NIT last year, I wouldn't be shocked if Indiana had an announcement on Monday, like 3 days from now, Monday the 17th. And you know, there's been rumors for a while that there's somebody already in place. Those rumors have not gone away. They haven't really been publicly talked about. They don't match the narrative that we get from a lot of reporters that there's active interviewing going on. I don't know if that's true or not. I do know that if you're going to go past that date, even if you're in the tournament, I wonder if Indiana needs to make an announcement on Monday, even if the season's still going, even if you're playing in Dayton or you're playing Thursday, Saturday, because to lose that extra time, to have to wait further, it really does create some complications. And a lot of people have said, well, a coach that's active at their current job isn't going to leave that job to go take another job until their season's over. That's true. And I think Indiana knows that. There's a lot of weird factors going on with all of this. And it is kind of the argument for, maybe IU was like, we need to get somebody on the ground right away. And that's more important than getting an active coach at a high level, at least at the college level. I don't know. This is the problem for Indiana and for all the teams that are going to have to change coaches this year and in other years, because the rules just don't help those teams at all. So you're going to have a 30-day window for players to enter the portal this year. So for men's basketball, it opens Monday the 24th and it closes Tuesday, April 22nd. Yeah, it's not a lot of time. To cut into that even by a week really endangers your ability to field a competitive team for the following year. I don't know what Indiana does. I don't know what some of these other schools do either, other than try to work as quickly as possible. And of the teams right now that are clearly going to have openings, you've either got teams like Miami, Virginia, they've already announced that their new head coaches are going to be, or you've got teams like Indiana that are like right on the precipice of being in the tournament. Texas is in this mix as well. A lot of people thought Rodney Terry was going to get fired. Well, they just won 2 games. They've made it a lot more likely they're going to make the tournament, which puts them perversely in a worse position for moving forward and moving on if that's what they decide to do. And now you've got a situation, I think, with Indiana where we're in this new frontier, earlier portal date, shorter portal time, a lot of different things you got to factor in, and you can't afford to sit out 2 weeks of the portal because you're waiting on somebody. I don't know how that all plays out. I'm going to be fascinated to see what occurs, but I'm confident that the folks that are making the decisions are aware of all of these things. I just want to make sure that you're all aware of it as well. Anyway, I've talked too long. I appreciate you sticking with me. I'll try to have some additional bracketology updates tomorrow. I'll have the bracket on the Crimson Cast Twitter account as well as it's already up on the Discord. So check us out there, and we appreciate it as always. Thanks again. Great to see some of you folks up in Indy yesterday, and I look forward to chatting with you again as we move forward through this weekend and we see where Indiana lands in the tournament. Our thanks to our presenting sponsor, Home Field Apparel. For Crimson Cast and for the Back Home Network, I'm Galen Clavio. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.